Good morning, everyone. If everyone can take their seats, we'll get started in 1 minute. Move this a bit closer. Good morning, everyone. We're going through a few technical difficulties here as we get logged into a new system. But as we finish that up, any votes that are taking place can be logged here as well. So I will get going out of respect for time. So welcome. We have a fairly long agenda to get through, including 2 commemorative naming proposals. We have also to consider the roadmap for staff to develop the provincially mandated community safety and well-being plan. Development of the plan will include extensive public consultation at each step to ensure that the plan meets the needs of our community. We will receive 2 annual reports, one on the city's security and emergency management activities and one on 911 service. Both of these reports highlight the very important work that's being done to respond to major incidents, including last year's tornadoes. We've been hearing from the community as well that it can be difficult to get an accessible taxi outside of working hours. So staff will update us on whether they can study on-demand accessible taxi service. We will also have the older adult plan, which received the Ontario Age-Friendly Community Recognition Award in 2018. And finally, we'll consider donation requests for surplus ambulances, a snowmobile, and a sled. While the city's decommissioned these items, they can be put to good use in other communities. So we'll get started with the agenda. Any declarations of interest? None. Confirmation of minutes from the September 19th, 2019 meeting. Carried. Communications. So the first response to inquiries, the RATS complaint inquiry, I'm going to hold that until Councillor Fleury arrives. He's running a few minutes late. The second one, paramedic offload delays. Similarly, I'll hold that and just come back to it. Commemorative naming proposal, Louis Kemp Arena. Carried. Commemorative naming proposal, Eldon Kemp Rink. Carried. Community safety and well-being plan roadmap. Carried. Security Emergency Management Service 2018 annual report. Received. Okay, we'll hold. Fifth report, 911 annual report on 2018, received. Okay, the sixth, feasibility review on on-demand accessible taxi service. I believe we have a motion on this as well, so I'll hold it for now. The City of Ottawa older adult plan, carried. Quick question? Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just noticed in the report that staff were planning to report back to this committee in 2023 based on the 2020 to 2022 time frame or initiative. Is it possible or is it normal that staff halfway through provide just a information report to this committee based on like a progress report or update?
Okay. Any comment from staff? Is that feasible?
Yes, of course.
Okay, terrific.
Just so we can
Great
get
suggestion.
an idea as halfway through.
Fantastic. So on the report, carried. Moving on, councillors' items number 8, donation of surplus ambulances. Carried. Number 9, donation of surplus snowmobile.
I'm okay with it. I have questions because we need snowmobiles for, I want to know if we have others.
Okay, so I'll hold that. Oh, he's joking. Are you joking?
I'll ask that.
Okay. So I'm holding it.
No.
Okay, carried? It's too early for your humor. Need more coffee. IPD. So we have the IPD use of delegated authority during 2018 by Recreation, Culture, and Facility Services Department. We need a motion to look at this. So we do have a motion on this by Councillor Eglai.
Thank you very much. So this is a technical amendment. Would you like me to read the whole piece? Okay. Be it resolved that pursuant to subsection 89.3 of the Procedure Bylaw, Community Protection Services Committee approved the IPDA use of delegated authority during 2018 by the Recreational, Cultural, and Facility Service Department as set out in Schedule E of Bylaw 2016-369. Be added to the agenda for consideration at today's meeting in order to consider the following technical amendment. Whereas the memo entitled Use of Delegated Authority during 2018 by the Recreation, Cultural, and Facility Services Department as set out in Schedule E of Bylaw 2016-369 was distributed to Mayor and Council on October 7, 2019, and will be considered by the Community and Protected Services Committee on October 17, 2019. And whereas following distribution, staff identified an omission in Section 17, Advertising and Sponsorship, and supporting Document 3, 2018 Sponsorship and Advertising Annual Report over $25,000, which inaccurately reported the number and value of sponsorships and advertising agreements that were approved and executed in 2018. Therefore, be it resolved that the Community and Protective Services Committee approved technical amendments to Section 17 to reflect the 20 sponsorship or advertising agreements that were approved and executed in 2018 for a total value of $6.82 million. And be it further resolved that Document 3 be updated to include the details of the sponsorship or advertising agreements as outlined in the attached Appendix A to this motion.
Thank you very much. On the motion, carried. And that's all then. Okay. So I will go back then to response to inquiries, the rat complaints inquiry, and I believe Councillor Fleury has a motion on this.
I do, and thank you, Madam Chair. So I'll just read it because I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Whereas rats are carriers of transmitters of disease that can negatively impact public health and create a negative perception of our city, particularly in destination areas with a high concentration of local attractions. And whereas best practices in controlling rats include eliminating food and water sources, eliminating living spaces, and protecting buildings to prevent infestations. And whereas in 2017, Council directed staff to establish a monitoring and baiting in sewer pilot program to address rats and to develop a long-term strategy for determining baseline rodent population. And whereas a working group including Ottawa Public Health, Bylaw Services, Public Works and Environmental Services, and 311 was created to coordinate efforts in addressing rat complaints and implement proactive measures, including increased education and outreach, adopting a specific service request classification for rats and rodents, proactive baiting in sewers, and enforcing property standards. And whereas the results of two-year pilot program to conduct proactive baiting in sanitary sewer through CCTV cameras have shown the rat population in sewers is low, with 8 sightings in 2018 and 23 in 2019. However, rat complaints in Ottawa have increased nearly 40% compared to 2015, with Rideau Vanier, my area, ward, representing 34% of complaints in 2018, which highlights the need for the working group to continue to develop solutions to address the ongoing rat issues in Rideau Vanier and across the city. The direction or the motion, therefore be it resolved that staff be directed to implement cost-neutral rat control methods, including specific rat prevention practices in regular parks maintenance, incorporating inspections for rats into the twice annual inspections of abandoned buildings, and issue orders to owner to remedy an infested if evidence is found. And therefore, further be resolved that staff in planning, infrastructure, and economic development be directed to assess the options under their mandate to implement a program for proactive rat baiting prior to construction and issuance of demolition permits. And if such a program is possible, report back to the appropriate committee with recommendations including how such a program could be administered. Detail any financial impacts and what monitoring could be in place to assess its effectiveness.
Thank you. And maybe on that, I see staff have joined us. If they wanted to share their thoughts on the motion, any concerns, implications?
It's Kevin's team that wrote the motion, but there's a specific question to
Okay.
infrastructure.
Okay.
So I don't know.
Chair, we don't have any concerns with the motion in terms of the area that Public Works, Environmental Services, and Bylaw Services are involved in. There's no cost involved. I believe my colleagues in Infrastructure Services, PIDE Department, do have some concerns, and they can speak to any questions.
Councillor Brockington?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Similar to Councillor Fleury and other colleagues, there are rat issues in my ward, not something I'm proud of, but that's the reality. And we have neighborhoods that are seeing rat populations that have never seen rats before. And staff tell me that there is an absolute correlation between some of our infrastructure projects and the displacement of rats from one neighbor to another, not just LRT. My concern is we're very reactionary to rats. We react when communities, streets call us in, we bait sewer lines, we have public education outreach, which is all good. I want to see proactive work done. And I don't know whether it's possible, and I just had a public meeting this week. Rats was one of the 3 main topics that we were talking about, but is it not possible before infrastructure projects begin that we bait sewer lines in the immediate vicinity of that work, almost to create a buffer, so that if we know rats are displaced during infrastructure projects, we protect these communities before the rats travel through them. And I'm not a rat expert, but it seems that we're always reacting. What can we do before rats move from community to community to ensure that that does not happen? And so my question really is what's being proposed the best way? Is this the best motion that we can do to not just address rat issues that exist now, but prevent them from getting worse in other neighborhoods?
Chair, I'll speak to the question the councillor had regarding proactive baiting in sewers. We can certainly do that, and we can work with our colleagues when there are big infrastructure projects and bait the sewers around the project. That's a very good suggestion.
Thank you. I mean, the next big infrastructure project is the redesign of Bank Street. We're having a public meeting tonight, Billings Bridge to Kitchener, and this will come up. So I don't want to say with assurance that the City of Ottawa is going to do that, but that certainly I'll be working with colleagues in public work, particularly before the work gets done, is we want to stop this before it becomes a problem. So I appreciate that commitment.
Councillor Agline?
Thanks very much. So, Mr. Wiley, just for clarity's sake, so of the motion, you indicated you have no problems with the parts that apply to your department. So can you just tell us what parts those are?
Chair, that would be proactive baiting in sewers, reactive baiting in sewers, and procedures in parks where there's evidence of rat infestation, particularly around litter containers. As you see from the response, there's a fairly low incident of reporting rats in parks, I think 6 over last year. But we'll make sure that staff take care of any evidence of rats in parks or any wildlife in particular in parks.
And is this something that you do in the normal course in any event? In other words, staff have training, or there staff that are designated for that kind of work?
On the park side, certainly staff are trained to report on a whole host of issues in parks, and this is one that we'll beef up and make sure that we have procedures in place. And the typical remedy in this case would be switching out, say, a wire basket that a rodent could get into for a steel drum, something like that.
Okay, thank you for that. And now to the other group involved. What are your concerns specifically about the motion? Are there parts of the motion you think you could do, or if you can't do any of it, why do you think you can't do it? What's the rationale?
Thank you, Madam Chair. For building code services, we would have an issue with regards to imposing conditions for any construction or demolition permit just due to the applicability of the law. The building code's clear as to what can and cannot be imposed as a condition of issuance. So any type of condition of this nature would not be applicable.
So when you say law, you're not talking about city bylaws or policies?
No,
you're talking
provincial-
about
provincial act,
legislation.
yeah.
So you're saying if we pass this, you couldn't do it in any event?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you for that. I don't know if that helps Councillor Fleury, and perhaps he wants to amend his motion in light of the fact that it's not doable.
That's only the third one.
That's what I'm saying. Are you prepared to take the third one off the table with staff saying that they don't have the capacity? In fact, it would be illegal.
Questions to staff, yes.
Okay.
Get motion circulated? Okay.
Madam Chair, do you want me to speak to that point as well from the planning services side of things?
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you. It's similar to building code side of this direction in that from the Planning Act perspective, so the application that would be associated with this possible review would be site plan control. And looking at the regulations in the Planning Act, I don't think that we would have the ability to impose a condition to this effect. We can certainly always ask, and if an applicant agrees to it, it would go in an agreement, but it would be something that would be difficult to enforce. But on the merit of the way the direction is phrased in the motion, it's sort of a take back and assess your options, and I think that's why we're comfortable with it, is we'll look at options. But as it stands today, from the planning services side to things, this would be very difficult to enforce through that application process.
Thank you. Yep, Councillor.
So this is a question to legal. Councillor Fleury's indicated that the legislation doesn't allow, but he feels that if we simply create a bylaw that says they can do that, that will get around the provincial legislation. I'm wondering if legal could speak to that as a way to do this.
Through you, Madam Chair, we'd have to look at the issue as a whole, and we could provide an opinion if that's how council wishes to proceed in terms of assessing the options.
I think it makes sense, Councillor Fleury, if there's some uncertainty before we send operational staff out to look at options that in fact may not be doable, that we wait to hear back from legal as to whether this is a feasible path forward or not. Well, no, but you're directing, as I understand, you're directing staff in planning, infrastructure, and economic development to assess options. What I'm saying is find out whether they're allowed to assess options in the first place, and don't waste staff's time doing something that legal's going to come back and say can't be done in any event.
But assess the options would be to consult with legal and work with legal.
Well, yes and no. What I'm saying is let's find out if staff even has any authority to do this. That's the first step. And you don't talk about legal here at all. You just talk about planning, infrastructure, and economic development. I'm suggesting direct staff, legal staff, to come back to committee and say whether this is a path forward or not. If they say you can't bypass provincial legislation by way of a bylaw, then we don't need to send these gentlemen and their associated staff off spending taxpayers' money on something they can't do in any event.
I think my motion is clear, but if it isn't, I'm glad to amend the assess the options to get legal to come back to this committee. That's certainly, you wouldn't see interference from my part on that.
Okay, but I think it should be a two-step process. We find out from legal before we send out other staff to spend resources and time trying to figure out a problem that they may not be allowed to do. So let's change the motion then, if we can.
Well, change that sentence. We've had to change that sentence, yes.
So we have to put it in there that before planning and infrastructure staff goes and looks at options, that legal report back to this committee as to whether that in fact is a viable option.
Okay, Councillor Blade.
Thank you very much. I appreciate we can't impose our own areas around building permits and demolition permits because of the provincial legislation. But could we not, and this is probably a question for legal, could we not put in place site plan conditions and or subdivision conditions in the same way we make developers clean up their mess as they're building a neighborhood or clean up their mess as they're building a building? We have volumes of requirements that we put on them to get these approved. Why can we not simply use that process? And if that's an option, and I appreciate we have a different type of legal staff with us today, then we may want to coordinate with the legal services group that works in with the planning committee. Because it could be a subdivision option, it could be a site plan condition. You know, we put conditions on all sorts. I don't think Councillor Fleury actually cares how we do it, it's just getting it done.
I'm not suggesting we don't do it. What I'm suggesting is we find out whether it's a doable thing before we send staff off to do all the work and create a bylaw. Have legal give us an initial opinion about whether that's, because we seem to be trying to get through the back door what we can't get through the front door, which may be okay, but it may be illegal. So I think we should find that out before we spend staff resources doing work that legal is then going to come back at the end and say, well, that's great, you've done all this work, but you can't do it. So if Councillor Flory is open to that, to this two-step process, having legal look at the feasibility of whether we can do it or not, and then they report back, and then we give direction to staff in planning infrastructure. Does that work? I'm not saying don't do it, I'm just saying don't waste staff's time and resources.
So I can read what I've amended. I'm not comfortable, the city doesn't work in a silo, so it's important that legal services work with their counterparts to get on solutions. So that I've amended it to the following. So this is the second clause. Therefore, be it further resolved that staff in planning, infrastructure, and economic development be directed to assess options with legal services under their mandate to implement a program for proactive baiting prior to construction of issuance of demo permits. If such a program is possible, report back to this committee with recommendations, including how such a program could be administered.
Perhaps, Councillor Fleury, if you can read that, the change one last time for everyone's consideration.
So the change is after assess options, I've just added including legal services. And then after an issuance of demo permits, and have extended it to development applications. And then following the report back to this committee with recommendations. So those are the three segments.
So if I understand what you're asking for, though, is you're asking for this staff to do the work before we know whether they can do the work.
No, I'm saying this staff, but work with this staff. Because what happens is the city works in a silo. If we
But
don't...
effectively what you're doing is you're asking this staff to do what you're asking for without finding out whether it can be done.
No, my motion asked them to assess options.
So why don't you simply say legal to report back first on the feasibility, and if so, then give these guys the license to go ahead?
I'm comfortable with the amendments I've made.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so just some additional insights here. This will have to rise to council next week. So between now and then, there is an opportunity for legal to provide their comments as to how feasible this is. So, fair?
I do have questions for staff.
On this as well?
Yeah.
Okay. Councillor Fleury?
So in the report, in the analysis, you provide pretty significant other jurisdictions in Ontario that are doing things. So maybe some members of committee haven't read through it, but in pre-baiting of demo, it's done in Halifax. Sure, it's not in Ontario, but it's done in Canada. Toronto does the park maintenance, and Windsor does the vacant buildings. So we have Canadian examples, even Ontario examples of municipalities that are doing something because they're faced with the issues. So I want to go back and dial it back a bit because I think we're really deep into an issue that we're losing focus on. The City of Ottawa a few years ago had two strategies. Kevin's team, Public Works, baited sewers. And then if there was complaints coming in through 311, bylaw services went out and got landlords often to correct the issue. But the gap was three-pronged. One, 311 wasn't properly capturing the calls, which is now in place, which is a good first step. If you don't have the data, you can't resolve it. The second one was, so who's responsible for rats that are at the surface, feeding at the surface, and once they've made it to the surface, they continue on to live. We see them in parks, we see them running through neighborhoods. No one owns that rat. They don't necessarily live in a dwelling. So there's that gap. And there's jurisdictions that are doing things. It would be a bit of money for us to do a little more baiting. I thought this motion was the bare bones of what we can do, which is, let's make sure that we do our own parks, which is public land. Let's make sure that when we do the visits of vacant buildings, that we ensure that if there's rats infestations, we ask actions. It's a dual positive because we also don't want vacant buildings. So if you get costs onto a vacant building property owner, chances are they're going to start moving faster. It's an additional cost. The city already does pre-baiting in construction sites. I've met with a team specifically for Montreal Road. They have a baiting plan and infrastructure services for that. So in my mind, it's the other ones at demo. And it's a tough one to crack because there's the Planning Act and Building Code Act, but we can incentivize and we can create measures so that it's simultaneous. So I think that this motion will bring us some strategies. I think the chair's saying that legal could do the work ahead of council. So hopefully we have a path to finding a way to resolve this issue. I know restaurateurs, I know renters, I know property owners that have all been affected by rats. And when they turn to the city, unless they're non-compliant, unless they're guilty themselves, they see little recourse. There's not really a lot of strategies for rats that move. So I'm just trying to put a system in place that could protect landlords, protect tenants, protect city staff. And the other piece is no one really owns it. You're seeing the groups here, Public Works, 311, Ottawa Public Health, bylaw services. That's part of this issue, is that the only active agent here is Public Works that could physically, they remove snow, they fix sidewalks, they fix potholes. That's a doer group. So it'd be interesting over time for them to have an additional mandate and paid for so that they can act on this serious issue.
Councillor Lulov?
So we recently had a major sewer revamp done in my ward. I did receive quite a few complaints from residents about rats. City staff were very clear that rat abatement measures were in place. I was wondering if you might be able to just explain what those rat abatement measures look like, just so I can understand this issue a little bit better.
Chair, if I understand the councillor's question correctly, what we would do in an existing sewer, was it an existing sewer or a reconstruction of a sewer?
A reconstruction of a sewer. So specifically, the project was on DeCarey near Bilberry and on Beauclair.
I apologize. We don't have staff here that would be familiar with. I understand it would be proactive baiting by the constructor. I'm not quite sure how they would do that. We would have to get back to the councillor on that issue. But in terms of proactive baiting within sewers, it's simply to drop poison in the sewer where you would expect a rat. We also monitor with our CCTV cameras incidents of rats as well, and we'll bait that way. And when we get alerted with a problem in any particular area of the city, we'll do proactive baiting in the sewer system around the area.
Okay, any further questions? Okay, if I can ask Councillor Fleury to then clarify which motion we are moving forward with to vote.
So I'm moving forward with the amendments that I presented before, except I was informed by our clerk that depending on which strategies are presented, options, that it's more appropriate to report back to the appropriate committee. Because if it is a planning matter, it'd have to go back to planning committee rather than, if it's a bylaw, it would be us. So she's asking me to remove to this committee and just leave it to the appropriate committee.
Just a quick technical question, but legal is, this is still going to go to council, the next council meeting.
Correct.
And legal has direction to give us an opinion before the next vote.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. On the motion as amended? Carried. Okay. Then moving on to response to inquiries, paramedic offload delays. And I believe staff have joined us here as well. I do have a few questions on this, as perhaps some of you do as well. Of course, the availability of paramedics and ambulances, I think, is a fundamental expectation of our residents and ourselves. And the delays that have been further outlined in the response, the delays at the hospitals are significantly reducing the availability of ambulances in the city. Back in August, I met with the mayor as well as Dr. Kitts from the hospital and others to discuss some of these challenges. And I think the intent of the inquiry submitted back in September, which we have before us today, it highlights significant challenges that have been created by these offload delays. And it does highlight or discuss a few possible solutions which staff have initiated to make some progress on this issue. So first of all, a thank you to staff for the response. There's a few questions, I think, to myself still outstanding. One of which is that in the response, you provided 3 items, or listed 3 items, that you believe will help alleviate the offload delays. There was the community paramedic pilot program, additional beds in hospitals, and re-examining the patient priority system. Can you give us an update of where those 3 are at today?
Certainly. Thank you very much for the question, Madam Chair. Those 3 initiatives, the first one, a community paramedic in the hospital, has since our discussions, has since been quashed by the hospital administration. If you think of the hospital as an island of medical authority, and we're on the island, but we're not able to provide care within that facility, which really brings us back to our initial assertions that the responsibility for that patient lies with the hospital. And really we've come to that inevitable conclusion that the hospital needs to provide that care. So that pilot is not going to move forward. The hospital beds is a hospital issue, and they have committed and said that those will be coming. We have not yet to date seen an effect of that initiative. And the patient priority system, which is a distribution scheme for patients within the city to be distributed to the various hospitals, the 4 main campuses, the Queensway, the Civic, the General, and the Mulfor, is established and agreed upon by the hospitals themselves as a process to provide the best care for that patient. It's not a process that is designed exclusively to reduce offload delays. So it is focused on the needs of the patient, and we follow the hospital lead on those patient care issues. And we're certainly open to modifying it, and discussions do continue on it, but no changes have been implemented there. We have 240 patients a day that need to be distributed to the hospitals, and our assertion is that if those patients are going to be there, the hospitals should be prepared to receive them in a timely manner.
Thank you. And I apologize, in my eagerness to talk about this issue, I missed a procedure, which would be a motion to lift this agenda, or this item for discussion, which I believe Councillor Eglay was prepared to make. Thank you. Carried? Thank you. Thank you. So following on to that, myself, I was surprised to read earlier in the Ottawa Citizen a letter submitted by the head of the emergency department from the Ottawa Hospital about this topic. And in the letter, Dr. Hubert asserts that processes are being implemented to free up city medics and paramedics, and that the hospital staff share the same goal, to care for the patient that is in front of us. I'm feeling a bit of disconnect between what I'm hearing, what I read, and I'd appreciate your comments on that.
Thank you, Chair. I was also surprised to read a letter from a hospital executive, letters to the editor. It didn't strike me as the best use of time or energy on the issue. So I want to be clear also, the tone of the letter became a little personal, and while I'm fine, our duty here is to you and the citizens we serve in the community. If that's the model that wants to be used, so be it. But I want to be clear, in every statement that we've made, we've been very, very clear. The issue is a management issue. It is not an issue of the nurses, the physicians, and the other staff that work extremely hard in the emergency rooms, that collaborate on a daily basis with our paramedics and assure continuity of care. The letter actually is somewhat perplexing because earlier this week, as we've just, the chief has just pointed out, we were working in the hospitals post your meeting and the mayor's meeting with the executive team. They've been working diligently. I've been kept up to speed by the chief and his staff about everything they were doing, and then suddenly we're not doing it anymore, so they walk away from it. So extremely frustrating. On the second point too, while it's true that our paramedics are fully committed to the care, what really worries me is that an executive who's responsible for the emergency room makes a statement about the patient in front of them. It's clearly he doesn't understand the systems approach to the model. When we respond to the community and we bring the patient to the institution, both in law and in fact, once we've crossed that threshold, that patient is now the institution's patient, and they must provide care. Because they don't, we're caught. I mean, it's a human being, it's a patient of ours. We can't just leave the patient on the floor and leave. That would be ethically and morally the wrong thing to do, so we don't do that, and our paramedics are kind of caught. I know they're stuck at the word hostage, but I know the chief reports to me that regularly that's what the staff describe. After a 12-hour shift, they're still stuck in an emergency room with a patient. They can't finish, so they use the term hostage. If that offended people, fine, we should find another term, but at the end of the day, we're caught with this patient that we fulfilled our responsibility. You've provided us with the appropriate resources that are deployed in the community that respond. We treat, stabilize the patients, then distribute them based on a patient priority system that the hospital have decided throughout the community and arrive at the institution. And our expectation is they take the patient. So for him to make that statement, it worries me, because as a leader, he should have a broader systems approach. What it does when there's 17 ambulances stuck in a hospital on offload delay, it does not allow us, based on the data and the deployment strategies that the paramedic service has put in place with regards to understanding where the call volume is, how to ensure that geographically we're ready to respond to our rural communities, our suburban communities, and the urban core. It completely negates all the investments you've done and all the strategies that we have to run a system properly. So it's quite worrisome that an executive would have that thought. So I certainly hope, discussions today and your questions will take the issue out of the letters of the editor and bring it back to the boardrooms where they belong as a managerial challenge. I mean, the facts and the data are there. They receive, as the chief indicated, we get some 240 patients that have to go to institutions. The Ottawa Hospital receives 80 a day. Management 101, when you have 80, and I hate to describe it this way, but 80 widgets arriving in your you have to be able to receive them. So put the appropriate staff and the beds to do that. In simple terms, what we've been asking and we're imploring to do is start Monday morning, redistribute of your 12,000 employees enough to receive those patients in your emergency room, and replace the 2 blue uniforms that arrive with a patient with people in white uniforms and take your patient, so we can return the community to fulfill our role in the healthcare continuum. So it is actually very frustrating that we're doing this debate, particularly because of your and the mayor's intervention this summer too. We thought finally we were on a path to solve things. Staff had limited opportunity, but as the chief reports, unfortunately, it seems that we were over optimistic.
Thank you. In the response as well, there was a mention of $400,000 in provincial funding that was announced for the dedicated nurse program. Can you comment on that? How's that moving forward?
Thank you again, Madam Chair, for the question. The $400K announcement, it surprised us both at the service and at our financial department. We do have a offload nurse flow-through fund that comes to the city and is distributed to the hospitals on an annual basis. This was off-cycle and not following those normal paths. So subsequent to the announcement, we were informed that funding had flowed directly to the hospitals and without any kind of intervention or involvement with the city. So we don't know how much went to each hospital or what was done with it. The intent was to work on this issue.
I know others have questions, but maybe just one last one around the number of level zeros that we're experiencing in the city. Obviously, this is incredibly concerning, I'm sure, to all of us here. Do we need to hire more paramedics to make up for these hospital delays?
Chair, I leaned over the chief and said I would answer this one for you, and in deference to him. I want to be very clear. We have a duty of care to this community. We are accountable to you as our board of directors, as elected officials, and we do this in a public forum. To do that would be resolving another organization of their responsibility. Currently, to give you a ballpark figure, the offload times and delays that we've reported to you equate to about 85 staff, so about $9 million a year that the hospital's coming into your pocket to use to staff their emergency room, in simple terms. And what that does is all the consequences that you've seen. We're at level 0, we can't respond to the next call. A whole bunch of other issues, and the chief's dealing with labor relations issues too as a result of it. People can't finish on time, they're not getting lunches, everything. So all this like churn. In any problem, you have to go to the source of the problem. That is, I can in good conscience, and the chief can in good conscience, recommend that we would be asking you to add an additional $9 million to the budget for us to resolve somebody's problem. From a fiduciary perspective, that's irresponsible as managers, so we can't do that. Management 101, this could be an MBA case study. What is the problem? The problem is when we arrive at the institution, they're not taking the patient. We have to solve that once and for all, and we have to work with our hospital partners, but it's not something anyone around this table can do. It is their responsibility. And I know we'll talk about alternative level of care patients, problems, long-term care beds, movement of patients within their institution. There are all challenges that they have to resolve. In the short term, just receive our patients, do what you have to do to put the staff. So, Chair, we can't recommend, and I get because this is a crisis by any definition, I get the thought of, well, why don't we just step up and cover that? That's not the right solution to this problem. So that's not something we could recommend to you.
Thank you. I just find this situation completely unimaginable. And, we did have our meeting back in August with the hospital and the mayor and struggling for what those next steps are. But, a takeaway for myself, for sure, will be to follow up with staff and the mayor for another meeting to talk through what those next steps can be, for sure. I know there's other questions as well. Councillor El-Shantiri.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, staff, for the report. If our residents are listening today, they don't give a hoot who's responsible is, because when they need an ambulance, they need an ambulance. And that is a problem we are facing in our community, especially the rural area. More often, the ambulance is not in our community. More often, we have to depend on a neighboring municipality to serve us. And I understand what the general manager is saying, and I fully agree with him. If we are to step up and hire more paramedics, all what we'd be doing, adding more to the 17 at the Civic Hospital was the other day when I passed by. So the problem is right there in the hospital, but I find it ironically, as we heard, we had that meeting, and to my understanding, we have an agreement to fulfill, but that agreement was, and why we are sitting quietly about it, I don't understand. Like, why we're not going publicly and pointing the finger at the hospital. They're not doing what they were supposed to be doing or what they agreed to do. Because I don't think you and I, we can stand one more time in the front of the rural area and say, I'm sorry, the ambulance was stuck at the hospital. Honestly, we use that so many times. Even I took picture many times of how many ambulances at the hospital. It still didn't help the people. Said, I don't give a rat, whatever. I need ambulance. That's what I do. So why we can't do more and maybe ask the public to put a pressure on the hospital to fulfill their portion of that commitment?
Chair, just a comment. I concur with the councillor's assessment. I too don't want to go back to another, and the chief doesn't want to go back to another rural community and say, there was an incident and we didn't have a vehicle responsible. They're all in the hospitals. It's a challenge. Staff has been working, and you can see in the report too, and I find it interesting that also in the letter to the editor, Dr. Bear said we're working collaboratively. All the initiatives that have been done are all city initiatives. Everything we've been done, paramedic response vehicle, offload nurse funding, all the other things are all initiatives that the city's done, collateral to their issue. They have done nothing since there, and I think we are being very public about it. I think we have an obligation to you, our board of directors, to tell you what's going on, and we are. I mean, I look at this, the highest level of this organization at the political level, our mayor and the chair of this committee, which we're accountable to, met with the institution's leadership. There were promises made. We worked diligently, and at the end, it's, a couple of weeks ago, the COO writes to us and say, yeah, no, we're not doing this anymore. And then in the letter to the editor, the person responsible for the emergency room saying, yeah, we're hiring people. So within the organization, it becomes frustrating. It doesn't seem that they're talking to each other. So Chair, I really don't know what to answer the councillor. He's absolutely right, and we're at a loss for words. That's why we're here discussing this today with you.
My other question to the general manager, does the city still help funding the nurse practitioner at the hospital, the one to offload the patient? Because you came up with a business plan convincing us at one point in time, if we make the investment at the hospital and we can save money on paramedic time and paramedic hold up, if you don't use the term hostage, hold up at the hospital. So what happened to that funding we give the hospital?
So Chair, that continues to be, it's an interesting, not dilemma, but story. Back in, at the time it was Minister Smitherman. At the time I was sitting in the chief's role, met with the Toronto chief and Minister Smitherman to say we can't, it was another crisis time, we said we can't handle this, and they funded the offload nurse program. So we continue to get that funding. It's been almost 10 years. We distribute over $1.5 million to the 4 institutions, of which the Ottawa Hospital gets more than half, for an offload nurse. That is still there, that continues. But obviously, because there's no focus on this issue, I mean, yes, the offload nurse is there, but they continue to, I mean, you saw the data, it's going the wrong way. It's actually increasing significantly. So, yeah, we continue to fund that $1.5 million, 100% funded by the province. It's not coming out, but it flows through us. Plus, the chair mentioned the other additional $400,000 that was just recently announced. To be honest, I don't know what they're doing with it because it's not having an impact on the data.
The other question I have about the community paramedic, or paramedicine as is the term used, and we've seen and we know the general manager, when he was the chief, he worked so hard with the ministry to continue that service in the area where we don't have really a paramedic service, unfortunately, because they're all at the hospital. So what would happen to those 2 paramedicine? Because we saw the numbers, since you have them on the ground, the call for service has declined by 30%. So obviously they're earning their paycheck. The question is, are we going to be able to keep that?
Thank you for the question. Through you, Madam Chair. The community paramedic programs that are in place are individually funded programs. We actively pursue that funding to encourage the continuation of those programs. They are, in a broader healthcare perspective, they are valuable in hospital diversion as well as reducing the impacts of disease in the community, and its collateral benefit is the hospital diversion. We continue to answer your question. We continue to promote those programs and actively solicit support for them through the ministry. And as funding flows, we provide that community paramedic program. It is not and it has not and is not intended to be a city-funded activity, because the mandate of the paramedic service at the city is the emergency response side, and we want to make sure that the funding that's provided by the city and the province to provide that service are concentrated on the emergency response side. So there are great benefits to it. We are looking for new avenues and new permissions, if you will, through changes in the Ambulance Act to provide more of those services. We are staring down the barrels right now of a flu season that does not have the same support it did last year. And so the oncoming volume there is something that we're very conscious of, and it will impact as well the crowding in the hospitals. I could say that the intent of the offload nurse is a capacity that increases capacity. It doesn't change the process or the activity in the hospital. And what we need is a rapid reception of our patients, not just another place to put them. We need the hospital to meet us at the door and take the patient when we get there. And whether they have an offload nurse that's funded by us or they have nurses that are in place as their staff is really irrelevant to us. We just want to have that transfer of care happen at the door as we enter the facility.
If I may, just so if they're holding our ambulances at the hospital, at the Ottawa hospital, obviously they're holding the other municipality who bring their patient to our city. And why don't we have it seems that the surrounding municipality, they're blaming us because obviously every time we need an ambulance, we have to go to their stockpile, basically, to get help, because they're always closer to us than the urban ambulance. So our number is in declining to meet the threshold we're supposed to have. The guide is a threshold the council put. I mean, it's going the wrong way. We're not achieving 90% of the time the call for or the response time. But I mean, if it's not just Ottawa, why don't we work with other municipality and create that political pressure need to be done? Like, I'm not sure if really having more ambulance from Ottawa is going to solve the problem here, because according to your report, you have more hours and more staff at the hospital than you have working.
Chair, and I'll let the chiefs jump in too. I think you raise a good point. I think there's two things. Absolutely, they are victims the same way we are. I'm trying not to use the word hostage, but they're also caught in the emergency rooms just like us every day. I think the distinction is, as an urban center, our call volume is like triple or quadruple their volume. So they they have less of that impact, so their resources stay a little bit more in the community. But you're correct, because we don't have anybody to go back into the community. So when the emergency call comes in West Carleton, the one ambulance that we have available, Chief Cassidy, because of the data, it's going to be in the downtown core, because every 6 minutes from this building, there's an emergency call during the week that comes out. So if you're going to have one ambulance, you're going to put it here, and unfortunately not in West Carleton or in Cumberland where I live. So when I have my heart attack cutting my grass, there's not going to be an ambulance either. So so directly to the question is, we have talked with our colleagues, and I'll let Chief Cassidy. I mean, I guess this is a problem across Ontario. I think it's probably more acute. I don't know if you've seen recently the latest standing of hospitals. I think the bottom three, it was the Civic, Hawkesbury, and then the General, or perhaps the Civic and the General. So the worst performers in the province are here. So it's more acute here. I think fundamentally, to directly your question, our colleagues look at the big city and us, and you, as far as weight is concerned, to solve this problem versus some of the smaller communities. That's the reality of what's going on here. So we're kind of left there to take the mantle and try to resolve the problem. Chief, I don't know if you have any additions to that.
Just that it points out another impact of that loss of resources. The reliance on extra municipal resources is increased if we're in the hospital, and their time on task when they actually do those calls is increased as well, and that impacts them negatively, obviously. They're right behind us, Councillor.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Brockington.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for your report. And to the General Manager, I think your leadership has been strong on this, and I applaud your efforts thus far. What we know already, 911 calls up, paramedic calls up, population is increasing, older adult population is increasing. This is only going to be a greater pressure. I think we all know this. I'd like to see Dr. Kitts here. We've invited other leaders to come here and give him the opportunity to present to this committee, tell us his perspectives, what he's under, allow us to have a discussion, but we've done the informal diplomatic routes. I'm saying this would still be along those lines, but allow Dr. Kitts to present at this committee, and I suggest, Madam Chair, you consider that as an option. Just on the metrics, this is my question. If metrics are collected at hospitals about wait times, specifically the offload times, and the Ministry of Health reviews these stats, why are the hospitals not being held to account for what we consider to be the unacceptable wait times?
I'll answer that by not answering that. It's not a relationship that we are privy to. We know that they report this particular metric. They report the time to assess patients. They report the time to offload patients. They don't, their perspective on the offload times is slightly different than ours. Ours is a function of when we arrive to the time we leave. They don't use quite the same numbers, but the same effect is there. It's more than it should be. And again, our contention is that a change in process is required that has the hospital staff receive us at the door. We've provided some technology and data, live data to the hospitals to help with that, as to forewarn them that we're coming. We've made some great strides in our data management and our situational awareness that we share with them. And again, once a change in process is put in place, then we will see some changes in the data and our ability to respond.
And maybe this has already been done, but if we know that there's a correlation between delayed offload times and the number of level zeros, going to Councillor Eli's point, which not just impacts the people of Ottawa, but the other service providers in the region who their own patients are waiting, but who now have to pick up the slack in our region. There's an opportunity for regional collaboration with the Ministry of Health. Say, look, it's not just Ottawa, it's all the counties around us or the regions around us who are impacted as well. We're all going to win from better service at these hospitals. So maybe you've already done that. I know we talk about other issues, but we really have to go, Madam Chair, I think, give the opportunity to the hospital to commit, but really focus on the Ministry of Health at this point. If we're not going to see movement within the hospital management, and we know that the issue is only going to get worse over time due to the aging population overall in Ottawa, then we don't have many options left. But I appreciate the update, and I just want to again reinforce I appreciate your leadership on this thus far. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Meehan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is not a new problem. We've been facing this situation for years, and I, for one, am totally angry and frustrated with it. And I am angry with the Ottawa Hospital, number one, for quashing initiatives that the paramedic service has come up with to hopefully to alleviate this problem. I'm baffled as to why our first initiative, having the paramedic in the hospital to accept the patients and wait there while they freeze up the ambulance, what was the rationale for them dismissing this initiative?
Chair, and I'll let the chief expect the rationale, which I don't know if he's going to be able to answer you, but initially when they were saying, we're having trouble hiring nurses, we've tried to hire nurses, we can't hire them, we're having retention problems, they had challenges, the chief and the team came out and said, listen, in the interim while you're doing that, can we help you out? We'll put a community paramedic, we'll do it while you continue to do your work, because we've got to get this thing moving. So, and I'll turn it over to the chief. We were moving down that path, and then he received notice that they were squashing that.
So not to get too far in the weeds with this, but our community paramedics have delegated medical authority through a physician, and that physician was engaged to provide that delegation, and upon further research on her part, discovered that she is unable to extend her medical delegated authority into the facility itself, because the facility itself, with the island analogy, is that all the patients in that facility are the responsibility of the facility and the medical authority of that facility. And an outside doctor cannot impose their medical authority into that environment. So the next step was, okay, well, there seems to be a lot of doctors at the hospital, so we'll ask one of them to do it. The same principle applies. The institution itself is the medical authority, and no one can provide that medical authority except for those designated by the institution. So we are not able to be delegated that authority so it defeated the purpose of providing care. The paramedics would be unable to provide any care in the emergency department, and that is what the hospital requires. So the hospital.
But it's okay for the paramedics that bring the patient into the hospital to sit there for 7 hours. That's okay.
Yes, the distinction is that the transfer of care has not occurred for 7 hours.
Is there any way that we can change something that enables a paramedic, or potentially if the paramedic service were to hire a nurse, let's take that $1.5 million that was dedicated into the nurse offload pilot program, take that money back, put it in our paramedic service, that we hire our own nurse to sit there. There has to be some way that we can facilitate having somebody there to enable to take those patients and then let the ambulances get back on the road. Because quite frankly, it's going to take someone's death, and the paramedic service is going to be blamed because we don't have the ambulances on the road. We've seen the paramedic service here go over and above trying to find solutions for this. So, I mean, if it's up to this committee to say, we would like to have that $400,000 from the government that was dedicated this year, plus the 1.5 that's split between the hospitals, that has to go to our paramedic service, and we have a medical professional who can keep those patients until the hospital comes up with they can assume responsibility to get our paramedics back on the floor. It does no good in this city to have our paramedics sitting in a hospital. And yes, it has to go back to the ministry because we are facing a really big crisis. But ultimately, you've come up with solutions, and I think in the interim, they should be acted on. And I don't know what this committee has to do to impress on Dr. Kitts that this is unacceptable, absolutely unacceptable going forward. And I do agree with Councillor Brockington's suggestion. We do have to have Dr. Kitts sitting here, and we have to ask him these questions. What is preventing him from allowing our ambulance service to do the job they're hired to do? This has gone on long enough, and it's got to stop now. If you can see a way for us to maybe impress upon the ministry, to give us the money to do what has to be done, because I obviously the Ottawa Hospital is just taking the nurses' pay and putting them someplace else, is defeating the purpose of that. Don't put that money into the system if that's where it's going to go. So let's see if we can get that money and do what we have to do with it at this point.
Chair, if I may, I think the councillor raises an interesting point, and her frustration and the logic that she's just gone through is exactly what we've been struggling in doing. Like, let's try to find a solution to this, find a solution. I just bring us all back. At the end of the day, she's absolutely right. We flow $1.5 million for an offload nurse. Things can, and the offload nurse is doing part of the job, but things continue going down the path. So now we're looking at solutions. We try to put a paramedic there to help them out. The councillor's right. So another strategy, why don't we take that money, we'll hire a nurse, put it in there. No. When one takes a step back and looks at it, and I'm trying to be, again, cold and a very analytical manager and saying, okay, what's truly the problem here? That institution receives 80 patients a day. It's, you're getting those patients every single day. We could probably even track for them and tell them the time of the day when those patients are going to arrive. In general terms, each weekday, each weekend, etc. It's predictability. It's modeling. And then you know how many staff and how many beds you had. And we didn't even get into it this morning, but we have occasions where we're told, well, you're on offload delay because you have to stay here. We have no more monitors in our emergency room, so we've got to use your monitor. So I look at all that and I step back, and I know I'm adding frustration, and that's not my objective here to do that, but to show you to what point the team has done, Chief Cassidy and his team have done, to try to assist the institution to resolve their problem. At the end of the day, the simple answer is we shouldn't be flowing $1.5 million in ministry money. We shouldn't throw another $400,000 in ministry money. Just assume your responsibility as you have, and I'm not hiding. At one point, we had challenges in this city. We had fallen behind in our growth, and you've not only stepped up as a council, we continue to get the growth, we have the resources to maintain the response to the community's continued growth. You're going to see that again in this year's budget. Now that's automatic. What we're losing is that capacity. It's not us, it's the institution. So I follow the councillor. It's interesting to hear her speak, because these are exactly the steps that we've been gone through to finally arrive at the conclusion is we have to stop solving somebody else's problem. The old adage of putting the monkey on our shoulders. This is their responsibility. If the chief had issues, and I'm trying to invent an analogy here, but if he had no fuel for his trucks, we wouldn't be going to the hospital. Can we borrow your credit card to put fuel in our trucks? We wouldn't be going to the hospital to say, we don't have staff, can you give us some of your staff to put on our ambulances? We fulfill our end of the continuation of care, so please provide yours. And I think in an institution with 12,000 employees, if it was a priority, tomorrow morning we would reallocate resources there. We're going to talk about a motion later on for accessibility, and we're going to find the money. I mean, we're asked that all the time as staff by our board of directors, can you find a temporary solution? So do that, resolve our issues so we can respond to the community, and then, I'm sure if he was sitting here, he'd talk about ALC patients, he'd talk about long-term care, he'd talk about the complexity of the healthcare system, which I completely agree with him, but those are all his issues. So it's a bit of a comment to say we've actually done that, and we're now at the point of saying, yeah, you know what, this is your issue, could you please resolve it?
And on the surface, and I'm no expert, but on the surface of it, if I were Dr. Jack Kitts and I knew that I was holding up these ambulances in my emergency ward, I would be addressing the issue ASAP. You dedicate a nurse to this. That's as simple as that. That nurse doesn't go anywhere else. Get those ambulances on the road. And I am asking this committee to express our anger and frustration on behalf of the community, because quite frankly, we don't want someone to die because this issue isn't being addressed. We have to stop it now. And I'd like to see Dr. Kitts here to answer to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Fleury?
Everyone's making compelling arguments as to the issue. I just want to hear the practical element. What is a respectable offload time? So paramedic arrives, crosses the door, enters the hospital. What is, to our services, what is a respectable offload time?
When this issue kind of started to boil maybe 18 months, 2 years ago, there was an acceptable or a standard time for transfer of care and offload of patients. That was about 30 minutes, or at 30 minutes. Subsequent to that, and through this process, we've signed an agreement with the Ottawa Hospital and with all the hospitals that where they commit to an immediate transfer of care. And immediate is meet us at the door. And that's what we are saying is acceptable now. We don't find it acceptable to stand and wait for 5 minutes. It's not acceptable. Meet us at the door, because your patient starts at the door. And that's where you need to be. So that's our position, that it's an immediate transfer of care.
And in legal terms, what is Ottawa paramedics or paramedics in Ontario, what's their ability to release a patient in their home setting or in a hospital, and what changes? I'm unclear about that.
So in the hospital setting, the paramedics must wait for the acceptance of the patient by the facility, and it's as loose as that. There's no obligation of any time on the part of the institution to accept that patient, and the paramedic is left to wait until, at the pleasure of the institution, the patient is taken.
And so what is the risk for our paramedics if we are to leave our equipment and leave the physical element in the physical hospital walls?
So a couple of things to that, Chair. So as I mentioned, in both in law and in fact, once we cross the threshold, the patient is the responsibility of the institution. They've recognized that, and we have actually Dr. Randy Zettel, who's an expert in legal matters. He's both a lawyer and a physician, who's presented several times here in Ottawa. We've brought the Ottawa Hospital Partners in, their legal team. Once we've crossed that threshold, that patient, if there's an adverse reaction 5 hours down the road, it's the hospital and the institution. The challenge we have is our responsibility is the community. So as was mentioned earlier, if everybody's stuck in the hospital and everything goes well because we're watching those patients, but somebody dies in the community because we don't have, then we're liable for that. And as the chief has just indicated to you, there's a human being on a stretcher. We can't just abandon the human being in the emergency room we could put other stretchers and put them on the floor and leave. That's not palatable. That's not ethical. That's not moral. That's not human. So we are really caught between a rock and a hard place. As we arrive at the institution and we complete our role, and yes, everybody recognizes it's now their patient. If they don't take that patient off our stretcher to put on their bed and assume their responsibility, we're caught in this gray zone, for lack of a better term. And that's what offload delay is. It's this play of like, well, it's not our patient yet because we haven't, as the chief has described, officially accepted that patient, so it's still your responsibility. It's extremely frustrating, and to be here today after all the work of all the years that we've done, it's even more frustrating, and I know for you as well, but at the same time, we have an obligation to let you know what's going on.
And what's the, we talked about the nurse pilot, but what is the ratio, like if we were to put in, I'll call it a I'm careful of my word, but a paramedic administrator receiver at the hospital, what would be the ratios there? Because I read 1 to 5 for the nurses, but would that change if it was a paramedic station?
It's actually 1 to 4, but again, I just caution you.
I stand corrected.
Yeah, no, but it doesn't matter. I still caution you. It's like, and I respect, Councillor Meehan was saying the same thing, Chair, and Councillor Fleury's doing the same. You're trying to solve somebody else's problem. We've been down this road for the last decade. It's got to stop. And yes, we could do that. Then we've actually proposed it, and the chief actually had a model where he proposed and how that would work, et cetera. But at the end of the day, we're going to take a medic off the road to put them in the emergency room to do their job. So that's one less ambulance on the road again. So it keeps coming circular, and I caution us not to go down that road anymore. We have to hold the institution's feet to the fire. And there are institutions that are doing some good work. I want to tell you, the Mulford Hospital, from the CO on down, his priority in the hospital is, as soon as the ambulance arrives, try to get them back on the road. They're not perfect, far from it, but their times have continued to go down. They find innovative ways, they find different methods, and they know it's their responsibility. God love the Queensway Hospital, who has huge challenges with regards to the geographic region that they bring in. They're overwhelmed. Well, I've seen them on some days declared a code orange, which means is a disaster in the hospital, to have the wherewithal and to do that and completely clear the hospital to be able to clear our beds. We don't see that from the other institutions. So there's at least a recognition for some institutions and others not. So that's the other challenge that we're seeing, this different dichotomy of approaches from the institutions.
And then what, if I were to use, you went really deep into, why it wouldn't work to have a administrative paramedic on site, but what if the city of Ottawa, we have doctors through public health, what if we were to hire a doctor who acts on behalf of the paramedics of Ottawa, stands at that door, and the fee for that doctor, we get the province to pay for it?
Chair, excellent ideas. We're trying to resolve their issue, and I don't want to put roadblocks. The chief just mentioned to you, under the legal status of that institution, that physician doesn't have the right to practice in that institution. He has to be a member of that institution. He has got to be approved by the physicians and pharmacists college within that institution. He has to follow delegated medical acts of that institution. And these are all roadblocks that even if tomorrow morning, I know even I was proposed, well, why don't we just change the legislation? It's not going to happen overnight. You're talking about medical ethics. You're talking about the College of Surgeons and Physicians of Ontario. So again, it's like, why are we trying to resolve something? You're an institution that receives 80 ambulances a day. Organize yourself to receive 80 ambulances a day. You are an institution de facto who has a paramedic service that does 240 transports a day, 145,000 responses. You provide miles, and you keep his feet to the fire to ensure that he's running an efficient and effective service to respond within a certain amount of time to provide advanced clinical care to these patients. That's where that's where I'm at now, and that's my recommendation to you. Do not try to resolve the institutional problems. Get the institution to assume their fundamental responsibility.
And on that last point, the authority of the hospital is through obviously their CEO and their board, and then historically it's been the LHIN. I believe now it's the Ontario Health structure of some sort. I don't know if that's been officially transitioned, but officially the authority body is the Minister of Health. And I believe that's Christine Elliott. So what interface or what are you recommending for this committee or for the mayor or for this city to do to advocate here? Because in the end, it's the same taxpayer. It's the same dollar that's coming out of pocket. We're just caught in administrative processes and a risk factor. So can you, if I'm wrong in the chain of command, please clarify, but what are you recommending that this committee and this city do relating to the Minister of Health?
We can explain if you want, but I think we're getting in the weeds for an executive team such as yourself. I think the chair made her statement. I think this needs, the highest level of this organization, our mayor and the chair of this committee on your behalf met with the team, You've got the report of the results of that. There are no results. We're going down the same path. I think directly to your point, the chair is saying we need to regroup, and perhaps that's the question that has to be asked. What is our next step? Members have talked about asking Dr. Kitts to come here. Perhaps that's an option too. But I think, to your point, yeah, what is the strategy? Is it the LHIN? Is it the Minister of Health? Is it other issues? I can tell you this is a problem across the province. We're seeing it more acutely because we have the worst performing institutions in the province, according to the provincial data. So it's becoming acute. But perhaps that's the best strategy, is to regroup with the mayor, the chair, and whoever wishes, and we'll provide any support or data or evidence that you need to make whatever strategy you feel is the best to move this forward.
Look, I have a lot of respect for Dr. Kitts, and sure, should he interact publicly with the media and answer those questions, absolutely. But I think that the most effective way would be for our chair and the mayor to ask for a meeting with our paramedic team and Ottawa hospital teams in the minister's office to hammer out a solution. So I don't know if that could be a direction. I don't know if how that could be taken, but I have no interest in having Dr. Kitts here. He has his own issues, and I respect the institution of the hospitals. I don't think that we're narrowing in on a very Ottawa issue, and it's a serious one, don't get me wrong, but to me it's overstepping the operations when I would really see a responsibility of the province, of the Ministry of Health, of the Minister of Health, to force the hand of the institution. So, Madam Chair, I don't know how you perceive that, if that would be a direction that you can undertake.
Mm-hmm. And I'd add to that that the mayor also did meet with the minister during AMO, so that did occur as well. I think that the approach that would likely be most effective at this point in time is to proceed meeting with myself, the mayor, and hopefully the team to strategize what that needs to be, whether it is the minister, possibly, or whether there are other options. So that would be my preference of how to proceed with it.
Okay, and you'll share that, your intent,
Absolutely.
with members?
Absolutely. Report back. You're done? Okay, so next is Councillor Blade.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I think everyone has gotten to the point, and I appreciate that you're going to, Madam Chair, you're going to sit down with the team and with the mayor's office and the mayor to strategize what to do next. I guess my question is, where has the board of directors for the hospital been in all of this? Because if Mr. Kitts isn't doing his job and he's not directing his staff to do their jobs, then our recourse is to the board of directors, who is responsible for running the hospital. So can you provide some insights as to where the board's been?
Chair, I'll echo previous councillors' statements about the same with us, the respect of an institution and the role that it plays in our community, the Ottawa Hospital and all our hospitals. Yes, we're talking about a crisis right now and it's affecting us directly, but I think that's important context. I'll turn it over to, because it's always delegate, it goes somebody's boss who we have a relationship, particularly the staff, but the chief did meet with the chair of the board, and perhaps I can let him talk about that experience, and rightly so, how he was directed back to the team, and we're back to the beginning of what we talked about and no results.
It was a good exchange of views with the chair of the board, and I believe the result was a focus of the administration, and I think we still see that focus there, but not the results. The meeting with the chair, she had obviously been briefed about what I was there to speak about, and so we talked about it, and there were a number of, she made the same type of comments about capacity of the hospital, these the regular issues, not to minimize them. But again, we maintain that it's a matter of replacing our staff with their staff. It doesn't require that long-term care beds open. It doesn't require that ALC, alternate level care patients, be moved. It doesn't require that that the hospital is turned upside down for a response to this. It's simply a matter of, as Mr. DeMonte mentioned, changing the blue uniforms for white uniforms. And it doesn't take up any more space. We're in the hospital. And actually, if you took my 36 medics out of there, you'd have a whole bunch of room.
Sure. So when we do reach that level 0, how many medics and ambulances would be tied up at the hospital at that point?
It's certainly variable, and I really want to be cautious that I don't want to create an expectation that if we solve offload delays, that there will never be a resource issue in the city. Resources are utilized and used, those instances of low levels will occur, whether or not the hospital delays are there. But when there are 18 vehicles in the hospital parking lot, that's a huge impact on our operations.
For sure. Well, I appreciate, Madam Chair, the seriousness with which you've already brought to this issue, and I know that you'll continue. If it took an hour and a half, I'd be dead. So we need to fix this. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Aglai?
Thank you very much. And Mr. DeMonte, I don't disagree with you about whose problem it is to solve, and part of it, and I think what you're expressing is the idea of downloading not only the problem but the financial responsibility on the city. And you may well have done this already. I'm just going to ask the question. So in terms of the model that the chief put together to have a paramedic on site, and you're concerned about taking a paramedic out of play, has it been proposed to the hospital that we'll give you the paramedic but you pay for it? And then that way you don't have a paramedic out of play because you still have our funding to have that paramedic on the street.
It is, that was part of that entire discussion, that it would be a costed, our community paramedic programs in principle are funded, and that would be the same with this plan. The plan did not die because of funding. The plan died because of the administrative impediments to it. It's impeded by the hospital's responsibility for the provision of care within the hospital. That actually impedes this plan.
So again, not telling you how to do your job, Mr. DeMonte, because I think you do it very well, but is a way around that, I just throw this out there, is a way around that is to take the person off our payroll, and by that I mean to second a paramedic to the hospital, then they're a hospital employee for that period of time?
Actually, we've explored that, and so the delegation within the institution, and I know I'm speaking to the chair of the Public Health Board, so you've got perhaps a broader understanding of some of this. So to practice within an institution and its physical being, you have to be an employee of except for physicians, they're not technically employees, but they work in the institution, so they have the rights to practice. To do that, a nurse, a respiratory technician, or any other health professional is delegated acts by those physicians and the committee of physicians. So those acts are written down, they're delegated, and a nurse in certain circumstances, you give this drug, you do that thing. So that's possible. Paramedics actually as practitioners can do more advanced medical acts than any other health professional except for physicians. But their designation, because they don't yet have a professional college within an institution, the physicians could not even delegate to them because they're not a health profession, because they don't have a college. So there's all these impediments. So absolutely, in your logic, it's like Councillor Meehan and Councillor Fleury were saying, it's like, yeah, let's look at and we've looked at all those options, and I take your questions appropriately. We've looked at it. Well, is that a solution? Is that a solution? So we keep coming back, though. I mean, I'm circling back again. It's like, okay, after all that's done and we've tried all that, why doesn't the hospital just hire extra nurses or whoever they require to replace, as we're now using the simple adage, replace the 2 blue uniforms with 2 white uniforms or 1 white uniform or whatever they think. So unfortunately, we keep arriving at impediments to try to resolve their issues.
But the impediments, if I'm following you correctly, Mr. Monti, the impediments seem to be at the provincial level. It's not the hospital, the institution itself, that is saying no. They're saying no because we don't have the administrative or the legislative tools to do what you're asking us to do. Has there been any thought of pulling the city and the hospital together, coming up with a joint plan that you could agree on in principle, and then go to the ministry and say, we think this solves the problem, but the problem isn't us, and the problem isn't the hospital, the problem is that your current legislation does not allow us to do this?
The plan that we developed in consultation with the hospital that centered on this community paramedic was intended to be a temporary measure until such time as the hospital would actually staff that plan. So I really like your suggestion that this plan be put in place, but the difference is it's a hospital staff person that take our community paramedic out of there, put your staff person in there, perform that function, which will eliminate our offload delays, and use that process to fix the issue. But again, it was developed as a temporary measure, and the hospital has agreed to all that we've said, but has not yet staffed this or made an impact on our operation.
And I don't know if you can share this or if you know this, but if the plan that you talked about that the hospital's agreed to but hasn't actually acted on, what's the cost to the hospital of doing that? Do we know?
It would depend on this kind of surge capacity of it, but a single nurse is pretty much the same cost as a single paramedic. So it would be, to have two at each campus, Ottawa or the Civic and the General. For paramedics, it's about 1.2 million. That's round the clock.
1.2 million a year. And that's to have it staffed to...
That's two. Yes.
But is that 2 people, or is that 2 people on duty at all times?
That's 2 people on duty all times. If you didn't need them at 4 in the morning, which you probably wouldn't, then maybe you'd have 3 there in the afternoon. But that 1.2 million gives you 2 people for the entire year.
So again, not putting words in your mouth, the hospital could solve this problem if they could find $1.2 million, in theory. I mean, you have a plan, they've agreed to the plan.
Yeah, no, Chair, I think the hesitation, and it would be my hesitation, we're getting into the administration and management of the institution, and to be candid and respectful to them, there are a lot of other complex issues, and I'm a little worried, we would go down that path, and they said, well, no, because of this. I'm just keep going back to the beginning, and I understand your train of thought and how to help them. It's like they receive on a daily basis 80 patients. They have to look at when they receive them, the time, we can provide all that to them, and then they'll have to organize, directly to your point, do you need a nurse, you need 3 nurses on day shift and only 1 on the evening and none at night? That would be up to them to figure that out. So again, it's like,
and I understand that.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to get is I'm trying to get some sense of the dollar. Like you had said earlier on, and fairly, we ask you for money all the time, and you go out and find it. So I'm trying to get a sense of how much the hospital might have to go out and find out of their budget.
My understanding is they attempted a 2 or 3, while this work was going on, 2 or 3 times to recruit nurses, and they get nobody. I don't know why that is. I mean, maybe they have to ask themselves as an employer what's going on in their emergency room, why nobody wants to go work there. But in the interim, directly to your point, why don't they temporarily reassign in those 12,000 employees staff to temporarily take care of this issue so it resolves our public safety, public health crisis that we currently have, and then do the recruitment and do the rest of it? I mean, that's a management approach, I think, that's palatable and one that could be used. But yeah, we are getting into the, I want to be respectful, I think.
Just trying to get a sense of the magnitude of the dollars, and you've helped with that, so thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions? Okay, Councillor Brockington?
Sorry, just one little one to clarify. 80 patients a day that arrive by ambulance. That does not include walk-in ERs.
That is correct, Chair, and that's an important distinction, and we're about 25% of the volume that arrives, but in respect, and rightly so, people are coming by ambulance, they're the most critical that generally all tend to be admitted to the institution versus the walk-ins that may wait for 10 hours in the ER and then they'll be released. So our impact is much more significant of what we bring in for the institution, and that's fair.
And that's 80 per campus. That's 80 at the general, 80 at the civic.
Okay. Thank you. So obviously a robust discussion on this, rightly so. As mentioned, I'll commit to circling back to this committee. I will meet with the mayor and the team to determine and strategize what these next steps need to be. Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate your leadership on this. So going back to the agenda, I believe we are on item number 4 was held, Security and Emergency Management Service 2018 and report. Councillor Brockington had questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I see Mr. Poirier here, which is good. Appreciated the report. And first, if I could just be reminded, was there a specific report tabled at this committee on the tornado response? I see the report, this matter embedded in this annual report, but was there previously a report to this committee on the tornado?
Madam Chair, no, there was not a specific report on the tornado from 2018.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing that. My question is, as one of the 4 wards impacted by the tornado, I met with Mr. Poirier a few months later for a post-mortem to talk about the city's response to the tornado. I had a number of suggestions. I just wanted to know what happened with the suggestions that he received from councillors. I don't see that here. I'm specifically looking at how to improve response going forward.
Madam Chair, following the tornado or emergency events, our normal practice is to do a debrief and an after-action report. And subsequent to the tornado, we have completed an after-action report. We had Callian consultant group come in and interview a number of people and also take the information that was received from councillors. That report has just arrived in the last week, so I will be able to talk further on that topic, and I can do that with you personally or through the committee as a whole.
Excellent. I'm appreciative of that. The other comment I had, if you recall, was how the city can better engage grassroots community organizations to be, and trained is the wrong word, but to be able to contribute to immediate needs in the first 48, 72 hours. We saw that good examples in Arlington Woods where the community came together, provided hot meals. I'm not talking about emergency service response, but I think that's one critical omission, at least in my ward, that I'm working on, is how do we take an inventory of what our community organizations have as far as barbecues, clothing, formula, things that can contribute to people who've been impacted by a disaster, so that if the city is overwhelmed with its services across a large geographic area, community organizations, and I'm not talking about the Red Cross or Salvation Army, I'm talking about community associations, church groups can respond. Is that going to be part of the report?
Madam Chair, yes, that will be part of the report. And over the last several months, I have met a couple of times with Councillor Eli Shanteri and community associations within his ward. And I'm planning on meeting also with Councillor Eglai and the Woodvale Church. For specifically what you mentioned is how can we better coordinate with them, but also understand the resources that they can bring to bear early in an event.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Eglai?
I just wanted to add, there was also a working group put together after the tornado called After the Storm, which Mark Taylor first co-chaired, then when Mark left, I took over co-chairing with Michael Allen. They released a report within the last month or so, and part of that working group, Councillor Brockington, were community associations and community groups from my area and also from Councillor Shanturi's area. I can certainly get you a copy of that report if you would like to see that, because that group took a more global approach to things. Pierre was part of it as well, though the city was part of that working group, but also reached out to other not-for-profits, other community groups who sat around the table and talked about lessons learned and sort of where we can go from here. So happy to share that with you, or anybody else who would like a copy around the committee. Just send me an email.
Okay. Terrific. Councillor El Shantiri?
Thank you very much. And I want to say thank you to Pierre for being open-minded from the flood 2017 when we hired a consultant and we worked together and we tried to fill the gap if there was a gap at 2017. But the tornado, more than anything, we can write a book about it, as some of the first responders said the good work was happening there. But go back to the community involvement, and I think that's something we're seeing more and more, some of the community members coming forward. They would like to do more. They would like to help the city more. They like to be engaged more, and I would like you to continue that focus on how, and I know we're not going to be sending volunteer versus firefighter or police or paramedic, but they have a job of their own to do. And from day one, we thought, we have now 2 floods and 1 tornado, time for us to have a city-wide emergency plan, how we activate I know the first responder, they do a great job. They're always training, and you heard they were training a couple of weeks ago, all NGOs in our community. But how could the city mobilize the community, the grassroots? That's something, and for them to be safe, but they need some engagement prior to the event. And I'm hoping with the report you're going to do about all the, how could we engage the community? And I know you get email almost daily from community members. They want to do more, they want to help more, but at the same time, we want to make sure they do it safely for them and for the rest of the community.
Thank you, Councillor. Through the Chair. An important piece of our review already is exactly how do we mobilize volunteers at the front end, almost instantly. And then, particularly in your ward, is how do we engage where individuals have already come together as a community and make use of their resources right at the front end. And what we've been doing is that through our own, through staff, we've been meeting with community associations. Anyone who's put up their hand as a community association, we've been prepared to meet with them to start the process of first the basics of emergency preparedness, and then working into, depending on the competency and recognizing, in particular in your ward, there's a significant competency amongst your community that they can do much more than maybe another community that just wants to know about what are the basics of emergency management. So we continue to work on that, Councillor.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Terrific. Any further questions? Okay, on the report, received. Fantastic. So that takes us to any notices of motions? None. Inquiries? Other business? Adjourned. Next meeting is November 15th That's a special meeting specifically on short-term rentals, and then November 21st on budget. Oh, apologies. I missed a motion.
Go back?
Can we go back?
Yeah.
Apologies. And where was it on here? Apologies, I did miss number 6.
Good to go? Okay. So this stems from our September 11th meeting when we were looking at the review of on-demand accessible taxi cab service. So I've got a motion basically to put into force what was in the report. So whereas at our meeting of September 11th, 2019, Council approved a motion directing staff to review the feasibility of conducting a review of on-demand accessible taxicab services, including recommendations for any potential improvements, and to report back to CPSC in advance of the 2020 budget process on the potential scope of work and associated costs. And whereas the committee has received from Emergency and Protective Services staff an information report providing the requested information and advising that a consultant on the city's standing offer list is available to undertake the work at an estimated upset limit cost of $25,000, with the findings of the study and recommendations to be brought forward in the fall of 2020. And whereas staff also advised that $25,000 could be funded within the 2020 operating budget within the Emergency and Protective Services Department, be it resolved that the committee directs staff to proceed and retain the said consultant to undertake the study of on-demand accessible taxicab service as outlined in the staff report, and that the $25,000 be provided through the 2020 EPS operating budget. Fairly uncontroversial.
Thank you. On the motion? Carried. And then on the report itself, this is a feasibility review on demand accessible taxi cab service. Received? Thank you. Apologies. And with that, officially adjournment.